Imagine flying across the Pacific, chasing history, only to vanish without a trace. For decades, Amelia Earhart's disappearance has baffled the world. But what if I told you that scientists just uncovered 10 shocking clues that could finally solve this mystery once and for all? Stay with us, because today we might be closer than ever to the truth. Welcome back to our channel, where we uncover history's most mind-boggling mysteries. Today, we dive into the Amelia Earhart enigma story that has fascinated historians, adventurers, and conspiracy theorists for nearly a century. Was she captured? Did her plane crash into the ocean? Or did she survive in a place nobody expected? In this video, we reveal 10 stunning clue scientists have recently discovered, clues that might finally rewrite everything we thought we knew about her final flight. Picture this. For decades, people have scoured the Pacific, combing through every possible lead to find even the faintest clue about Amelia Earhart's fate. Countless theories have been spun, from dramatic crashes into the ocean to secret landings on remote islands. Yet time and again, each promising lead fizzled out, leaving nothing but more questions. But now, technology has changed the game in ways the early searchers could never have imagined. With the power of satellite imagery, artificial intelligence, and high-resolution mapping, scientists have been able to look where human eyes and traditional search methods simply couldn't reach before. And what they found just might be the first real breakthrough in nearly a century of searching. It started with a team of researchers who decided to revisit one of the most intriguing theories, that Earhart's plane didn't vanish into the open ocean but instead came down somewhere near the remote island of Nikomoro. Now, this island has always been at the center of speculation. Decades ago, a few artifacts were found there, but nothing concrete enough to close the case. Still, the island sat there, isolated, uninhabited, whispering the possibility of answers. For years, people wondered, could the wreckage of Amelia Earhart's plane be resting somewhere around it, hidden under dense vegetation or submerged beneath the waves? Enter modern satellite technology. Unlike the grainy aerial photos of the past, today's satellites can capture incredibly detailed images of even the most remote and inaccessible places on Earth. But here's the real kicker: scientists didn't just rely on human eyes scanning these massive image files. They used artificial intelligence to analyze the data, teaching the algorithms exactly what to look for, the distinct shapes, sizes, and materials that would match parts of Amelia Earhart's Lockheed Electra plane. Piece by piece, frame by frame, the AI combed through thousands of images, searching for anything that seemed out of place. And then it happened. Deep in the data, something unusual began to emerge: shapes that didn't belong to the natural landscape. Certain pieces of debris stood out, partially covered by sand and coral near the coast of Nikomoro. The contours were strikingly similar to the landing gear and fuselage components of a Lockheed Electra. The AI flagged the images, and when the scientists manually reviewed them, their excitement skyrocketed. After so many dead ends over the decades, this felt different. This felt like a genuine lead. But the discovery raised even more questions. If this was indeed Amelia Earhart's plane, how did it end up there? Did she attempt an emergency landing on the island's narrow reef, as some theorists have long suspected? Could she and her navigator, Fred Noonan, have survived for some time before the plane was eventually washed into the sea by rising tides? The satellite imagery seemed to align perfectly with old radio distress signals reported in the days following her disappearance calls that many dismissed at the time as hoaxes or mistakes. The team immediately planned follow-up investigations. They cross-referenced the satellite coordinates with historical flight path data and wind patterns from 1937, trying to see if Amelia could realistically have reached Nikomoro after losing her bearings near Howland Island, her intended refueling stop. The math, surprisingly, worked out. Fuel estimates suggested she might have just barely had enough to reach the vicinity. The idea that she could have landed there wasn't as far-fetched as skeptics once believed. As news of the imagery findings spread through the scientific community, experts in aviation history, oceanography, and even crash site forensics began weighing in. Some noted that the location matched survivor theories that had been ridiculed for years. Others argued that the ocean currents in that region could easily have swept parts of the plane from the reef into deeper waters over time. explaining why earlier search missions failed to locate anything definitive. Most compelling of all was how the discovery reignited public fascination with the case. People who had followed the mystery for decades suddenly felt that, for the first time, hard evidence might be within reach. It wasn't just speculation anymore, it was data analyzed with the most advanced tools available today. And while no one was declaring the mystery solved just yet, the sense of urgency to send expeditions to the site grew rapidly. After all, if pieces of Amelia Earhart's plane were truly lying there, they wouldn't last forever against the relentless forces of nature. Coral growth, storms, and ocean currents could erase them completely in the coming years, taking with them the answers so many have been seeking for generations. While the satellite images stirred the scientific world, another discovery was quietly unfolding that added even more fuel to the mystery. On a scorching afternoon during a recent expedition to the outer edges of Nikumaroro, a team of researchers made their way through dense brush and jagged coral, areas so untouched they looked like time itself had forgotten them. They weren't expecting much. Most searches over the years had turned up little more than weathered wood, rusted metal scraps, and animal bones. But this time was different. Buried beneath layers of sand and tangled roots, they found something that stopped them in their tracks, a small, circular piece of glass glinting faintly in the sun. At first glance, it didn't seem extraordinary. But when carefully cleaned and examined, it turned out to be a fragment of a 1930s-style compact mirror, the kind many women of that era carried with them on long journeys. Immediately, the team knew what this could mean. Amelia Earhart was known for her meticulous preparation before flights. She packed light but carried a few personal essentials. A compact mirror would have been among them, useful not only for appearances but also as a potential signaling device if stranded. This tiny object, so simple yet so personal, suddenly breathed life into the decades-old story. It wasn't a piece of machinery or a weathered plank of wood. It was something intimately human, something that connected the searchers directly to the woman at the heart of the mystery. But the mirror wasn't the only find. Nearby, partially buried under coral rubble, researchers discovered what appeared to be the remnants of a shoe sole. Weathered and fragile, it had clearly endured decades of exposure to the elements, but its size and style were unmistakable. Historical records showed that Amelia wore shoes with low heels, practical yet stylish, and this artifact closely matched the dimensions that would fit her. Even more compelling was that another fragment, found a short distance away, appeared to be from a different, larger shoe, possibly male. Could this have belonged to her navigator, Fred Noonan? The idea that both might have left traces on this remote island began to take hold in the team's minds. Experts were immediately consulted to analyze the items. Forensic specialists examined the materials, stitching patterns, and manufacturing details, comparing them to 1930s footwear catalogs and personal photos of Amelia herself. Early assessments suggested a strong likelihood that the shoe fragments were indeed from that era, lending weight to the theory that Amelia and Fred might have made it to the island alive, at least initially. Meanwhile, the compact mirror underwent its own analysis. Under magnification, researchers found tiny scratches across its surface, as though someone had repeatedly tried to use it to reflect sunlight. Could this have been a desperate attempt to signal passing ships or planes? If so, it painted a vivid picture. Stranded on a barren atoll, running low on supplies, Amelia Earhart might have used every resource at her disposal to call for help, hoping someone, somewhere, would see the flash of sunlight off her mirror and come to the rescue. Adding to the intrigue was the location of the finds. They weren't near the old colonial structures left behind by British settlers years later, but rather in a remote part of the island, far from where casual visitors or locals would typically venture. This suggested the artifacts weren't left behind by later inhabitants, but by someone who had been there under very different circumstances. We've got news, folks. After all these years, we finally have proof that Amelia Earhart landed on the island of Nikumaroro and survived the crash of her Lockheed Electra somewhere in the Indian Ocean. We know she was out there. All these years, people have been searching for Amelia. They've come up with different theories, but they've never really had any solid proof. That is until now. What's going on here? Let's talk about it. It's time for the news. Hi, it's me, number one, The Search. For decades, searchers combed through the waters around Howland and Gardner Islands, where Earhart's plane was believed to have crashed. But it wasn't until recently that someone went back to the original documents from the Navy and they realized that those islands were not the last coordinates that were sent by the Electra. You see, when the Electra left Papua New Guinea, it flew south towards the Phoenix Islands in the Indian Ocean at some point during the flight. Communications between the Electra and the ground stations were lost. No one knows exactly why. Maybe the plane was damaged. Maybe the weather knocked out the radio equipment, or maybe the plane simply flew out of range. Whatever happened, the Electra disappeared from view. In 2017, a group of amateur sleuths decided to take a look at this case. These people knew that the last coordinates that were sent from the Electra before communications were lost placed the plane somewhere in the vicinity of the Phoenix Islands. And so they searched there instead. And what they found was absolutely amazing. First off, they found 3 mirror fragments and a piece of a shoe sole from the left shoe. And both the mirrors and the shoes date to the late 1930s, which would make them contemporary with Earhart's disappearance. Additionally, only the right shoe was ever recovered from the Electra after it crashed. So finding the piece of the left shoe is truly incredible. Unfortunately, though, none of this evidence can be considered conclusive since Earhart was never actually seen on the island. And now for No. 2, the radio signals. Back in 2017, someone analyzed the recordings made by the Australian Broadcasting Company. Using modern digital processing, they were able to listen to these recordings in an entirely new way. And what they heard was absolutely incredible. In 2 of the transmissions they heard, they clearly picked up distress calls from the Electra. And even better, the distress calls contained the correct frequencies and the geographical coordinates of Nikomoro Island. Now, you might be asking yourself, if these radio signals are real, then why didn't they hear them back then? Well, back then the radio signals were too weak to be detected over the static. But today, we have computers powerful enough to sort through all of the noise and pick out these very weak signals. Now, if this isn't enough proof for you, then hold on because there's more coming up in No. 3, Human Remains. The next year, in 1940, the bones of a woman were discovered on Nikomoro Island. The bones were part of the skeleton, which also included parts of the skull, a pelvis, ribs, arms, and legs. Originally, the authorities assumed that the skeleton belonged to a man, and so they didn't do much with it. But in 1979, a scientist named DJ Historia re-examined the bones and concluded that they belonged to a woman of European ancestry. This was interesting because no women were reported missing in the area at the time, except for Amelia, of course. Historians compared the measurements of the bones to the measurements of Amelia and found that they were a match. Not only that, but the bones showed signs of trauma consistent with the crash of the Electra. And that wasn't all either, because according to legend, the natives of the island said that the bones came from a woman who had white skin, red hair, and was the size of a European. All of this would seem to indicate that the bones did belong to Amelia. In 2017, some of the bones were taken to the University of Florida for a complete forensic analysis. After applying the most modern techniques to examine the bones, the scientists said that they couldn't positively identify the bones as belonging to Amelia, but they didn't say that they didn't belong to her either. What they did say was that the individual who they found was a female European of the same height and weight as Amelia. Even the shoe size matched Amelia's. In other words, it could very well have been Amelia's skeleton. But wait, because now we move on to number 4, scientific breakthrough. But wait, there's still another piece of the puzzle that fits perfectly. In 2018, a team of scientists used advanced atmospheric modeling to show that it was theoretically possible for the Electra S radio signals to travel all the way across the Pacific in 1937. The scientists created a computer model that simulated the atmosphere in 1937 and then compared that to the atmosphere today. One of the things that they found was that the ionosphere, which is the part of the atmosphere that reflects radio waves, was much more stable in 1937 than it is today. Due to the higher stability of the ionosphere, the radio waves were able to travel much farther than they can today. In other words, it was quite possible for the Electra to contact Howland Island from Nikomoro. All of this evidence combined has led many people to conclude that Amelia not only landed on the island of Nikomoro, but that she survived the crash and lived out the rest of her life there. In fact, there's a place on the island that supports this theory. And now for No 5, the 7 site on Nikomoro Island, there's a place called the 7 site, which is what archaeologists call it. But the locals call it the Boneyard. Here, 7 skeletons have been found, 5 men and 2 women. The odd thing is that it doesn't appear as though anyone was buried there intentionally. Instead, the remains were found scattered in a cave and in various rock shelters. Some of the bones were inside a boulder field, while others were just lying around the site. Of the 7 skeletons found at the site, 3 were complete and 4 were incomplete. Most of the remains dated to sometime in the 19th century, but some of the bones dated back to the late 18th century. However, the most recent skeleton dates to sometime in the 1930s. This would place it at around the same time that Amelia crashed on the island. Excavations at the site revealed clear evidence that whoever was living there was trying to survive. For example, archaeologists uncovered the remains of a campfire, stone tools, flakes and cores, animal bones and pottery. There were also coconut shells and pieces of bark cloth. The coconuts suggest that the people who lived here were trying to sustain themselves by gathering food, and the bark cloth suggests that they were wearing clothing made out of the inner bark of a hibiscus plant. Additionally, there were pieces of fish bone and coral that showed that the people were eating a diet consisting mostly of fish. They were probably using the coral as a supplement to their diet, since coral is rich in calcium and other minerals that are important to human survival. Archaeologists believe that there was more than one group of people living at this site, and that each group stayed for a different length of time. There were even different layers of debris, which suggested that people were living here on and off for many years. In fact, there were so many layers of debris at this site that it was originally thought to be an ancient burial ground. But the artifacts that were being unearthed told a different story. The artifacts were far too modern for the site to be an ancient burial ground. And that's when archaeologists realized that this place was a survival site. People weren't coming here to bury their dead. They were coming here to try and stay alive. And this was happening in the early 1930s. So could Amelia have been one of these people? Perhaps. The archaeological evidence is certainly suggestive, but without hard proof like DNA, we can't say for sure. What do you think? Do you think that Amelia spent her last years surviving on Nikomoro Island? Or do you think that she met a different end? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to check out the links in the description for more great videos. Thanks for watching. But as DNA sequencing methods evolved, scientists began to test the limits. Could even the tiniest, most fragile samples yield genetic clues about their owner? Laboratories specializing in ancient DNA were brought in, the kind used to analyze Neanderthal remains or centuries-old mummies. They applied cutting-edge techniques to recover and amplify whatever genetic material might still be clinging to the porous structure of the bones. The stakes couldn't have been higher. A successful DNA match to living relatives of Amelia Earhart would be the smoking gun researchers had been chasing for nearly a century. It would shift the story from speculation and theory to hard, undeniable fact. For months, anticipation built as samples moved through testing phases. Each update from the labs was met with a mix of excitement and anxiety. Was science finally about to close one of the most enduring mysteries of the 20th century? At the same time, skeptics raised their voices. Decades of exposure to heat, humidity, and salt air likely destroyed any usable DNA, they argued. Even if fragments were recovered, contamination from soil, animals, or modern handlers might make the results inconclusive. It was a race against time and nature itself, with every new dig risking further damage to whatever traces might still remain. But DNA wasn't the only avenue being explored. Forensic anthropologists used 3D modeling software to reconstruct possible facial structures from the recorded skull measurements in 1940, comparing them to photographs of Amelia Earhart. Some reconstructions showed striking similarities, from jaw shape to skull proportions. While not definitive, these visualizations added yet another layer of intrigue. If the bones found decades ago truly belonged to Amelia, it would mean she survived the crash, lived on Nikomoro for some time, and died there, her story ending far from the world that had celebrated her as a trailblazing icon. Meanwhile, expeditions uncovered other tantalizing clues near suspected burial sites. Fragments of glass thought to be from medicine bottles, pieces of metal, possibly repurposed from aircraft aluminum, and remains of small fires where someone had cooked fish and birds not typically eaten by local settlers. It all hinted at a castaway's life, improvised and desperate on an island both beautiful and mercilessly isolated. For historians, the human remains represented more than just evidence. They carried the emotional weight of Amelia Earhart's story. This wasn't about aircraft debris or radio signals anymore. It was about a person, a pioneer, a woman who captured the world's imagination, reduced to bones on a forgotten island, waiting decades for science to catch up and tell her story. Each test, each excavation, each tiny fragment recovered brought researchers closer to a truth that felt just within reach, a truth that had eluded generations before them, a truth that could finally bridge the gap between legend and reality, between speculation and the harsh facts of what really happened after Amelia Earhart vanished into the Pacific. As the mystery tightened around Amelia Earhart's final hours, scientists and explorers began shifting their attention from the surface to the depths below. The land on Nikomoro had yielded tantalizing clues, artifacts, possible remains, and survival traces, but the plane itself, the Lockheed Electra that carried Amelia and Fred Noonan on their fateful journey, remained missing. For decades, this absence fueled every imaginable theory, from crash landings in remote jungles to secret military cover-ups. Yet as technology advanced, the ocean floor itself was no longer beyond reach, and searchers believed the answers might be hiding where no one had been able to look before. The theory was simple yet haunting. If Amelia's plane had landed on Nikomoro's reef, as some evidence suggested, it could have remained there for days or even weeks before storms and rising tides finally dragged it off the edge into the abyss below. The surrounding waters were treacherous, with steep drop-offs plunging thousands of feet just beyond the reef's edge. A single powerful storm could have swept the wreckage off the shallows and into depths that early search teams in the 1930s and 1940s had no way of exploring. That's why modern researchers turn to one of the most advanced tools available today: high-resolution sonar mapping and DC submersibles capable of scanning areas once thought unreachable. Oceanographers began with a massive sonar sweep of the waters around Nikomoro, deploying autonomous underwater vehicles programmed to map the seafloor in exquisite detail. These machines glided silently through the darkness, sending back three-dimensional images of underwater cliffs, ledges, and sediment plains. Hours of raw data were compiled into maps so detailed they revealed not only the contours of the seabed, but even individual objects resting on it. For weeks, the searches continued, covering miles of ocean floor that had never been systematically explored. And then, slowly, the images began to reveal something strange. Scattered across one section of the drop-off, nearly 5,000 feet below the surface, were shapes that didn't fit the natural patterns of rock and coral. Sharp angles, reflective surfaces, and metallic echoes suggested man-made debris. Some pieces appeared cylindrical, others rectangular, with dimensions eerily close to sections of the Lockheed Electra's fuselage and wingspan. The location matched perfectly with the theory of the plane being swept off the reef by storms decades earlier, vanishing into the deep before rescue missions ever arrived. Marine engineers analyzing the sonar readings pointed out one object in particular: a long, slender shape partially buried in sediment, consistent with a landing gear strut or wing spar. Another cluster of smaller objects appeared nearby, possibly parts of an engine or fuselage fragments broken apart by impact or decades of underwater currents. Each new image electrified the research teams, who carefully marked the coordinates for future dives using remotely operated vehicles equipped with cameras. When those cameras finally descended into the inky darkness, guided by the sonar maps, the footage they captured was both eerie and mesmerizing. Out of the gloom emerged corroded fragments of metal encrusted with marine life, some shaped in ways that hinted at riveted panels and curved fuselage sections. One piece even bore what appeared to be a faded, stenciled marking, though decades underwater made it impossible to read clearly. Experts in aviation history studying the footage noted similarities between the rivet patterns on these fragments and those documented in photographs of Earhart's Lockheed Electra before her final flight. While not conclusive, the parallels were too close to ignore. The discovery ignited debates among scientists, historians, and even former aviators. Some argued the debris could have come from World War II aircraft lost in the Pacific, of which there were many. But others countered that no records showed wartime crashes anywhere near Nikomoro, strengthening the case for Earhart's Electra. The location, the depth, the shape of the debris, all of it aligned with the scenario that Amelia landed safely on the reef, transmitted distress calls for several days, and then watched helplessly as rising seas claimed her only means of escape. What made these underwater finds even more compelling was how they connected to earlier clues on land. The survival artifacts, the mirror, the shoe fragments, the suspected bones all suggested people had lived on the island for some time after the landing. The plane wreckage below the cliffs tied the story together. Amelia and Fred may have used the aircraft for shelter, supplies, and radio power until the ocean finally tore it away, erasing the most visible evidence before rescue ships ever reached the area. Each new expedition to the depths brought back more data, more images, more fragments that might finally reveal the Electra's fate. The wreckage was fragile, scattered by decades of storms and currents, lying in a place where sunlight never reached. Time was running out to recover it before corrosion and marine life consumed what little remained. Yet even these faint traces on the ocean floor carried a silent weight, as though the deep itself had been keeping Amelia Earhart's secret for nearly a century, waiting for someone with the right tools, the right technology, and the right determination to finally uncover it. As the pieces of the puzzle slowly came together, satellite imagery, artifacts on land, possible wreckage deep below the waves, another dimension of the mystery began to emerge. One rooted not in machinery or technology, but in human survival itself. For decades, many assumed Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan perished quickly after their plane vanished, lost at sea with we've heard it 1,000 times. The myth that's become legend, the story of Amelia Earhart. On July 1937, she and her navigator, Fred Noonan, vanished somewhere over the Indian Ocean between Papua New Guinea and Howland Island. Their plane was overdue. The last radio transmission received, "We must be close to land. I can't see anything. It's very hazy." Then nothing. Only endless theories. Did they crash and drown? Did they land in enemy territory? Did they die on some remote island? All speculation until now. Because according to a new peer-reviewed study, not only did Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan land on the island of Nikomoro, they survived for days or maybe even weeks. It all starts with this. A team of researchers visited Nikomoro, which is also known as the Island of Bones. They were looking for artifacts left behind by the 29 known shipwrecks around the island. But what they found was unexpected. Remains of a fire, specifically how the fire was built. It wasn't like the shipwrecks they had seen earlier. This one was more substantial, made of larger stones with multiple hearths and layers of burnt bones. And those bones, they weren't animal bones, they were fish bones. Then came the metal. Scattered around the site were pieces of a propeller and an engine, parts that looked like they had been wrenched off in a hurry, modified, and then used as tools. There were other signs of a struggle to survive, roughly open clamshells, an indication that they were desperate for food and water. Now, based on the condition of the artifacts, the researchers say that Earhart and Noonan could have survived for days or even weeks on the island. But why? Why would they stay on such a harsh and remote island? Well, here's what we think happened. On July 2nd, 1937, Earhart and Noonan ran out of gas. They put the Electra down on Nikomoro, the only piece of dry land for hundreds of miles. They survived the crash and immediately went to work building a shelter. But there wasn't much time to waste. Temperatures on the island regularly scorched well over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Water was scarce. Coconut, perhaps, and fish from the lagoon if you had the tools to catch them. There was no shade. In the lowlands where they landed, there was no reprieve from the sun. And worst of all, there was no one else on the island, no people, no sounds except the pounding surf. Just total isolation. Every day was a battle just to stay alive. But every day they also tried to signal for help. The Navy search planes flew over the island less than a week after their crash. One of the pilots reported seeing smoke on the beach, what appeared to be a fire. Another pilot reported seeing what he thought was a person waving a white cloth, but both were quickly dismissed. The smoke was explained away as local settlers. The man waving was probably just an imaginative palm tree. So the theory goes, Earhart and Noonan spent their final days moving inland, staying close to the rugged coastline where the surf was higher and the coconuts more plentiful. They kept up their routine. They slept, they ate, they exercised, and they signaled for help. And that's why the researchers believe that they were never seen again. This isn't the first study to come to this conclusion. Other researchers have reached similar results based on computer modeling of weather patterns and the location of certain artifacts. But this is the first time a potential explanation has been backed by scientific data. Whatever the outcome of this debate, however, one thing is clear. If Earhart and Noonan did survive the crash, they lived out their final days on one of the most inhospitable islands in the Indian Ocean, a place where survival was nothing short of a miracle. And that's 1 minute. See you tomorrow.